And this is a testimony to what could be done in America, that a man could come over with nothing, having purchased his passage on credit, come over and then worked that credit off, and then gotten some land of his own, and then his son, his grandson, great-grandson were able to accumulate more land and more property until John Dickinson was born, and he inherited a large amount of land where he had multiple dwellings in Philadelphia and in Delaware.
During his boyhood years, John would form a strong attachment to the wheat fields, rivers, and marshes of the family farm known as home place. Here in this serene setting, John received early training from his father. At the proper age, a formal tutor made visits to home place to provide young Dickinson with the kind of classical education that would serve as a great resource to him in later years. Like other young men of his social standing, John was sent abroad to study law. He sailed to England in 1753 and entered Middle Temple, part of the Inns of Court. Possessed of a conservative temperament and refined tastes, John used this experience to develop social connections that would last throughout his lifetime.
Dickinson's time in law school was very important in a lot of ways. So he spent his time over there and then entered into the Delaware Assembly. He started out as just a member of the Assembly, and within 3 months he had become Speaker of the Assembly. So a very quick rise. At the same time, he began to establish a law practice in Philadelphia and made a name for himself very quickly in Philadelphia as a brilliant orator, very able barrister, and soon after that he entered into the Pennsylvania Assembly and immediately rose to be one of the leaders in it.
It was in Philadelphia that he met and married Mary Norris. Mary was a Quaker, and her father, Isaac Norris Jr., was Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. John's marriage to Mary, along with the property in Pennsylvania she brought to the Union, enabled him to strengthen his social and political ties in Philadelphia.
See where women come in? I mean, okay, because
In
she had money,
1764,
but...
Dickinson opposed Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Galloway in their attempts to make Pennsylvania a royal colony. While he considered himself a loyal subject of the Crown, Dickinson was becoming increasingly concerned with the British trade and taxation policies. Soon after, Dickinson advocated for independent trade for the colonies in a pamphlet entitled The Late Regulations Respecting the British Colonies. The passage of the Stamp Act ignited the first sparks of the coming revolution, as citizens took to the streets to protest taxation without representation. The Stamp Act Congress convened in formal opposition to the new tax, and Dickinson was chosen to draft a Declaration of Rights and Resolves to be sent to the King of England.
One of his major contributions was not necessarily in the Stamp Act with these resolutions, but he began writing pamphlets about how Americans should resist the British. And while in other parts of the colonies people were getting restless and they were becoming violent, he was writing to promote a way of resistance that was originated by the Quakers in the 1650s, and that was civil disobedience. And if you do that, there's very little that the government can do against you. They're not going to come after you with guns. They're going to have to change the laws. And it was probably a mixture of the civil disobedience along with the violence that was coming out of Boston. And the Stamp Act was repealed. And this was a huge moment where Americans had won their point without very much bloodshed. Shortly after that, the British decided they would pass another act, or a series of acts. It was the Townshend Acts. And when they were passed, Dickinson was immediately alarmed that nobody seemed to care. Whereas Americans have been very upset about the Stamp Act, they seemed completely complacent about the Townshend Acts. So this prompted him to write his most famous piece called The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania.
I will now tell the gentleman what is the meaning of these letters, to convince the people of these colonies that they are at this moment exposed to the most imminent dangers, and to persuade them immediately, vigorously, and unanimously to exert themselves in the most firm but most peaceable manner for obtaining relief. The cause of liberty is a cause of too much dignity to be sullied by turbulence and tumult. Those who engage in it should breathe a sedate yet fervent spirit, animating them to actions of prudence, justice, modesty, bravery, humanity, and magnanimity.
They are probably the main reason that he's called the penman of the revolution. This is an apt title in some ways. It is true that Dickinson wrote more for the American cause than any other single founder. But everything he wrote, including the farmers' letters, he wrote to prevent revolution.
There's a second part.
At this time, America was part of Britain. There was no nation, there was no sense of national identity yet. So the farmers' letters were a huge moment in Dickinson's career and also in American history. They got Americans for the first time united against Britain and standing up for their rights, really as a country for the first time. The people were united, but it also started pushing them towards revolution. It was a turning point. Another thing he did at almost exactly the same time, also in 1768, was he published what we could consider to be America's first #1 hit single. It was called the Liberty Song. He wrote this to a British tune, and this was sung in every tavern across the colonies. And he was really seen as a popular idol. He was America's first political hero with this.
Social media campaign.
He was an American hero, and by the time of the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, Dickinson wielded more power and influence in America than probably any other single figure, and he always counseled diplomacy. I think a key turning point for Dickinson with his reputation was in July of 1775. He wrote two crucial documents that seem like they contradict each other, but they're of a piece. He wrote first the Olive Branch Petition, and this was a near final effort to appeal to the crown to say, look, we are your subjects, and please, we want this to work out. The very next day, Congress issued a declaration on taking up arms. Two drafts were written, one by Thomas Jefferson and one by John Dickinson. The one that they published was aggressive, saber-rattling, it was threatening, and it basically said, go ahead, bring it on. You come on over here, we're ready, we'll fight you. Now, most people have assumed
Sound
that
like somebody
Thomas
I
Jefferson
know.
wrote that draft, and Dickinson wrote the one that was kind of soft and timid. It was exactly the opposite. Dickinson wrote the angry, fiery, threatening one, and his intent was to produce such apprehensions in the British that they wouldn't dare come over and try it. He really wanted to avert war any way he could.
Don't tell me we're not related. I'm doing the same thing. They're fiery when I send my letters through the post, and they say, is there anything flammable in here? And I just say, only my words. And of course, they laugh.
The battles at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 ended.
Okay, then there's John Paul Jones. This is a song.
When John Paul Jones was a little boy, he pointed to the sea. Said, when I get to be a man, a fighting man I'll be. I'll leave my mark on the ocean and my name in history. When John Paul was a member of the British Admiralty, he killed a sailor on his ship, which was a crime, you see. He changed his name to J.P. Jones and came to America. He fought in the rain and he fought in the sun and he fought in the moonlight too. He fought with his knife and he fought with his gun and he fought till his blood ran blue. But John Paul Jones was a fighting man was he. He sailed to the east and he sailed to the west and he helped set America free. When John Paul was a captain in the U.S. Naval Band, fighting for the glory and the freedom of our land, he made those British captains wish that they were on dry land. He sent their mighty vessels to the bottom of the sea. He took their bags of treasure and he sank their chest of tea. He gave his blood for all free men and his life for liberty. He fought in the rain and he fought in the sun and he fought in the moonlight too. He fought with his knife and he fought with his gun and he fought till his blood ran blue. But John Paul Jones was a fighting man was he. He sailed to the east and he sailed to the west and he helped set America free. He fought in the rain and he fought in the sun and he fought in the moonlight too. He fought with his knife and he fought with his gun and he fought till his blood ran blue. But John Paul Jones was a fighting man was he. He sailed to the east and he sailed to the west and he...
So it repeats itself now. I thought that was cute. Yeah, so that's John Paul Jones. That's a little blurb. I mean, there's other stuff you can find on the internet. The stories about him, movies about him. Now here's
Continental
Trump.
Congress, most powerful navy the world has ever seen. John Paul Jones, America's first great naval hero, said, I wish to have no connection with any ship that does not sail fast, for I intend to go in harm's way. He got his wish many times when his ship was shot into pieces off the coast of England by a British vessel and her 4 dozen guns. When demanded to surrender, Jones very famously declared, I have not yet begun to fight.
Trump should check out my Facebook page. You see my Facebook page, that's what I quote John Paul Jones. I have not yet begun to fight. I mean, everybody wants to run me out of town. My landlord now trying to get me thrown out on the street. He even said, you're going to live in a tent out on the street. I mean, ever since I got into the divorce, I mean, just the really, the reverse discrimination is just horrific. Reverse discrimination. I mean, why should he have to be saying that? It's discrimination, and they're hate crimes. I mean, real hate crimes. As I said, the Spanish women, oh Lord, they hated me because I always had to be doing something. That's why people hate me so much. I have to always be doing something. Or you know, they're jealous because I succeed. It really, really is tiring. And you know, a government's legitimacy emanates from providing for the general welfare and the obligation to protect their person from foreign and domestic enemies. And it's just not being done. All they're doing, everybody at the international level, it's the same thing. They're all closed up in their little stupid ivory towers and running around between all of them, blah, 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 and they have no idea what's going on the ground. Because they're too busy to deal with the little people in the world. And that's the truth. I mean, I've been doing this now for 12 years. I've been back here. I mean, okay, if I've been here 6 months, a year, we'll give it some time. No, I mean, and I've been watching this country. I mean, already when I left in the 80s, it was going downhill, and now I've just been watching it. Okay, it's getting late, so I'm gonna leave this one for tomorrow, but I am going to, this is my letter to Prince Charles. So this was sent January 2018. Your Royal Highness, I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but with my humble duty, I'm contacting you regarding the dire state of world affairs and your family's power and authority, and addressing the underlying problems, namely the escalation of nationalism, violence, and political extremism in countries around the world. In order to eradicate these dysfunctional trends, it is imperative that Western economies, with the USA, England, and Western Europe taking the lead, produce the paradigm shift leaders within the development community, particularly Jim Yong Kim, President of the World Bank, Antonio Guterres, and Ban Ki-moon, Secretary and former Secretary General of the United Nations, have been and are advocating. Unfortunately, due to rampant bureaucracy and mismanagement within their respective organizations, along with the International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde and other Bretton Woods initiatives, they are all failing to produce the paradigm shift that they themselves are vocally advocating. The beginning of the current state of world affairs can be found in the global expansionism under Queen Elizabeth I and rise of the British Empire in the following centuries. European monarchs followed the lead of the British in the 16th century with colonization, based on domination and oppression of the entire world. This set the scene for modern-day globalization, the good and the bad. It also set the scene for World War I and World War II, with the possibility of mankind's self-annihilation confronting the consciousness of man with a burning challenge, Galliano, and which provided the genesis of the modern-day human rights movement. Unfortunately, the secular human rights movement of the past 70 years has not been any more effective than the religious human rights movement of the past 2 millenniums, which began with Jesus Christ and Christian religions, as well as with Muhammad and Muslim religions. During my first stance living abroad in England in the mid-1970s, I often heard questioned the role and legitimacy of the English monarchy. A debate which I believe I can lay to rest in defense of of constitutional monarchies, particularly the model provided by the British Crown as well as Spanish Crown under its present constitution and legal codes. Sorry. Members in my family tree have been debating and discussing the legitimacy and structure of effective governing, religious and secular, with the British Crown for over 500 years. Going back to the time of Elizabeth I. Thomas Wilcox was co-author of Admonitions to Parliament, aka Puritan Manifesto, 1572, in which he called for reforms within the Church of England and British Crown due to systemic abuses of power and concentration of wealth and hedonism of the ruling elite. As explained in my blog, Economic Stability, the Puritan Manifesto, and the Two Mr. Pens, Part 1. 2 centuries later, another in my family tree, John Dickinson, penman of the Revolution, was calling for reforms in British rule of the colonies under King George III for the same fundamental reasons: abuses of power by ruling elite. In 1774, with a petition to the king, and again in 1775 with the Olive Branch petition, both these correspondences were ignored by King George, whose response to the second was a proclamation of rebellion against the colonies, escalating tension between the two and setting the stage for war. King George's refusal to receive and consider the Olive Branch petition portrayed him as intransient and unresponsive to the rights and needs of his subjects, providing John Adams and other like-minded founding fathers the opportunity to call for a separation of the colonies from Britain. One of the most radical and opposing of the founding fathers was Dickinson. Founding fathers from Dickinson was Thomas Paine. One of the most radical and opposing of the founding fathers from Dickinson was Thomas Paine, whose publication Common Sense gained popular support for those who advocated for an American independence and war with Britain. In Common Sense, Paine explored at great lengths the origin and design of government in general, as well as contested the legitimacy of monarchs in the section entitled Monarchy and Hereditary Succession, in which he drew a very dark picture of monarchs and therefore their legitimacy. Unfortunately, American history of the past 2 centuries, culminating in a growing autocratic and oppressive government in the USA, provides evidence supporting John Dickinson's contentions and arguments, which sought a peaceful and conciliatory solution with the British Crown instead of separation and war. While Dickinson and Paine were in much agreement over the origin and legitimacy of government stemming from natural law and social contract theory, their stance on the role and legitimacy of monarchs in democratic procedures were on opposite ends of the spectrum. As Dickinson and Paine and many others agreed, the legitimacy of government arose from its ability to provide for the general welfare, as explained by historian Robert Natelson in his article, The Constitutional Contributions of John Dickinson, Penn State Law Review, Volume 108, 2. Dickinson implied people had 2 sorts of rights or powers: those who exercise could harm others, and those whose exercise affected only oneself. Upon entering political society, people contributed some of their rights or powers to the central authority. Ideally, those contributed should be those in the first category. Man must submit his will in what concerns all to the will of the whole society, and the authority of the whole must be coexistent with its interest. We may think of the rights contributed as inalienable rights. When all people yield to society the power to injure others, then all could enjoy their retained rights more fully, because everyone received protection from injury and freedom from fear. Everyone benefit as a result. This was the common good or the general welfare. So I'm not going to read through all of it, but I'm going to read the other part of Nadelson, which compares Dickinson's view towards monarchs with Thomas Paine's. However, when it came to monarchs and monarchy, the stance of Dickinson and Paine were completely different. In Common Sense, Paine provides a deprecating analysis of monarchies and kings, from which I quote. Sorry, it's getting late. If we inquire into the business of a king, we shall find that in some countries they have none, and after sauntering away their lives without pleasure to themselves or advantage to the nation, withdraw from the scene, and leave their successors to tread the same idle round. In absolute monarchs, the whole weight of business, civil, and military lies on the king. In England, a king hath little more to do than make war and give away places, which in plain terms is to impoverish the nation and set it together by the ears. A pretty business indeed for a man to be allowed 800,000 sterling a year for, and worshipped into the bargain. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. See, this is what they were objecting to. This is what everybody's always objecting to. You know, the narcissists, the queen and kings for a day, that just want to party and live a hedonistic life, but not contribute anything to the social order. We see it time and time again in history. Dickinson, on the other hand, appreciated the role and importance of kings within executive branches, particularly within the British monarchy, and its ability to assure effective checks and balances between the three branches of government. And I quote again from Nadelson. Remember here, with the three branches of government, there's no oversight. To each his own, everybody do what they want. Dickinson was an admirer of the British Constitution. In Great Britain, liberty had been preserved largely by the balance between the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the executive, and the judiciary. In Britain, the executive preserved its independence from the other branches through the prestige of the crown, the power to create peers, the authority to veto legislation, and the ability to influence the Commons with patronage. You know, networking, being friends. Patronage means being friends with them and networking and talking to them. Create peers. You know, they can appoint lords and ladies. It's not the universities who are dishing out the PhD and MBA for money. Those are our new peers. Let's see. The British judiciary had become relatively independent, a development Dickinson supported to ensure the purity of the courts of law. Now, independent judiciary doesn't mean no oversight. In fact, it means kind of the opposite. It means that the courts, whoever it be, the judge, usually it would be the judge, but the judge or anybody in there is not being unduly influenced by the other branches of government or a private citizen. So when they talk about the independence of the judiciary, it doesn't mean they can do whatever they want and nobody's going to call them out. No. I mean, this goes back to the Bar Association in Madrid. That it's the right of your lawyers to violate your rights under the principle of judicial independence. No amount of training in the world would give these people a brain. And that's the problem. That's what I told Gina Pioni when I left ICD. I said, what you gotta do is hire people with brains instead of lots of awards and diplomas, but they don't understand anything. So, for like other good Whigs, he supported the rule of law. That meant that the law was to be kept certain. Again, this is what I was saying. For uncertainty renders property precarious and greatly exposes us to the arbitrary decision of bad judges. I'm getting tired. He followed Beccaриa's dictum that good laws should prevent radical inequalities and diffuse their influence universally and equally. When the delegates' attention turned to the executive, Dickinson again argued that ends should come before means. In his June 2 speech to the convention, he focused on the problem that he and his fellow delegates, who personally had known only monarchy, would encounter in creating a Republican chief executive. The executive should be independent. The executive should be independent from the other branches. But hitherto, executive independence had been achieved only in limited monarchies. In England, the executive's power was extensive. It arose from the monarch's wide powers and from the attachment which the crown draws to itself. That is, the monarch's prestige as a national symbol and his power of patronage, by which he could attain private citizens and members of the House of Commons to the royal cause. In America, a monarchy was out of the question. The spirit of the times, the state of our affairs, forbade the experiment, if it were desirable. The convention's task, therefore, was to look for institutional substitutes that would render a Republican executive as independent from the legislature and judiciary as the king was in England. Okay. I'm gonna stop and I'll finish this up tomorrow. I'm getting quite tired. So, again, I will finish this tomorrow. Wear your masks, please. And good night.